Sword Art Online, Progressive, 004, Scherzo of Deep Night, written by Reki Kawahara, illustrations by Abec, design by PP, read by Mae Zurita. Fifth Floor of Aincrad, December 2022. 1. I never expected this day to come, thought Asuna, the level 16 fencer, as she held up her chivalric rapier +5 in a mid-level stance. 16 feet ahead, a swordsman with black hair and black coat was doing the same with his sword. His stance looked lazy and relaxed, but the sharp point of the blade stayed utterly still, gleaming coldly as it absorbed Asuna's gaze. They were facing each other within a square, surrounded by mossy ancient ruins. The area was silent, with no hint of player or monster alike. The light coming through the outer aperture of the floating castle was weak, closing toward the dark purple twilight by moment by moment. Today, the 52nd day since the official start of Sword Art Online, the game of death in which the loss of a player's avatar ended the life of the player. In the real world, it was December 28th, 2022. In 4 more days, a new year would arrive, assuming they lived to see it. I'll survive until next year. When she first ventured out into the wilderness, she'd never even considered that possibility. She had taken store-bought rapiers, not bothered to do maintenance on them, hadn't even realized that was possible, in fact, and used them up as she fought relentlessly against the countless monsters, resigned to eventually battle at Yofel Castle on the 4th floor against forest elf soldiers who looked just like any player. Even that experience had not been as frightening as this. How can fighting another player be so different from that? Is it because I'm fighting against Kirito? The tip of the chivalric rapier she held wavered. Kirito didn't miss his chance, lunging forward on his left leg. The elvish sword was no longer held lazily, but dead still at eye level. He would either unleash a propulsive normal attack or a leaping sword skill. She had to guess which one and react ahead of time, but her rapier wouldn't stop trembling. No. Another rasping groan escaped her quavering lips before she realized it. No, I don't want to do this. She held down her misbehaving right hand with her left, pushing it toward the ground. Her eyes left Kirito's face and settled on the stone below, indigo in the darkness. She knew it was childish reaction, and there was no guarantee that Kirito would stop, but Asuna kept her face stubbornly pointed down. With time came the sound of boots scraping on stone. Next, the sound of blades slicing air, the light ting of metal. When she looked up again, Kirito had returned his longsword to the sheath on his back and was throwing up his hands in exasperation. So you've changed your mind, he said, with a wry smile, checking on the dual timer in the upper half of his vision. You were the one who asked for a PvP lesson, Asuna. 5 minutes later, Kirito had started up a little campfire in the corner of the ruins that had been their dueling area. He pulled an iron kettle out of his inventory and set some water to boil. To her surprise, he even had the branches to burn for a fire. When did you pick up those? She asked. Here and there on the 3rd and 4th floors, he replied, smug for some reason. He pulled one of the lit sticks out of the fire. See how the color of the flame is a bit different from your average fire? Now that he mentioned it, the flame was glowing on the tip of the branch. It looked a bit greenish. This is a harvesting item called fossil wood branch. They burn a lot longer than typical dead branches. I spotted them while walking around the lower floors, so I picked some up just in case. After all, he paused and gestured with the branch at the stone ruins around them. The 5th floor is a floor of ruins. There are very few trees here, so it won't be easy to come across these supplies. Oh, if you would have told me, I would have picked up a few of those too, Asuna said, which earned a skeptical smile from Kirito. I don't know about that. You can only find fossil wood half buried in damp soil. I have a hard time imagining the fedacious Asuna placing such muddy item in her storage. I wouldn't mind that. It's just a digital storage place, so it's not like the other items would get mud on them. Also, when you pull them out of the ground, they sometimes have gross bugs on them. So Asuna widened the distance between herself and the flaming stick in Kirito's hand. The swordsman returned it to the campfire with a hearty laugh. By that time, white steam was issuing from the kettle. So Kirito poured the boiling water into the already packed teapot, waited 15 seconds, then poured the liquid into 2 cups. Here. She took the cup, thanked him, then breathed in its scent. She bought those leaves in Novela, the main city of the 4th floor. They smelled somewhat like a fruit-flavored rooibos tea. With her arm around her knees, she took a sip of the hot liquid and sighed contentedly. The last bit of sunlight was gone now, and the area was covered in blue darkness. On the lower floors, the moonlight shining in through the outer aperture of Einkrad provided a little illumination to go by. But here on the 5th floor, there was hardly any light at all. If it weren't for the campfire, Kirito would just be a black silhouette beside her. Yesterday, they'd gone from the exit of the spiral staircase straight to the main town. By the time the night had fallen, they were resting at an inn. All day, they were busy fulfilling quests, so she hadn't realized that the night was so dark here outside the town. As a solo player by trade, Kirito had the search skill, so he would warn her if a monster or something dangerous was approaching. But she couldn't stop her mind from imagining something lurking out there in the darkness, beyond the stone walls that surrounded the ruined square. Asuna unconsciously slid her rear an inch and 3/4 closer to Kirito, then mumbled, "I'm sorry about earlier." Huh? For what? She was expecting that response and immediately continued. For quitting the duel that I asked you for in the first place. Oh. Well, look, I don't mind at all. Kirito took a huge swig of tea, then grimaced at the heat. He glanced over at her. Just seems a bit rare for you to give up on something you started. She nodded and rested her chin on her knees as she hugged them with her left arm. It's just wasn't quite what I imagined. This duel, but it's not really a duel because it was in the, what did you call it? First strike mode? So the first clean hit wins and it's basically safe. I thought it would be more like a match? A sports competition? But Asuna's mouth worked soundlessly as she tried to come up with the words to describe the fear that snuck into her heart when the blade matched blade. But before she could succeed, Kirito muttered, "There's at least one major difference between SAO duels and real-life sporting matches." She glanced over at the swordsman in the black coat sitting crossed-legged in the stone. His eyes, blacker than the darkness, were looking into the fire. They were slightly narrowed, staring back into distant memories. I think it's the motive for fighting. In sports, even in competitive fighting, it's victory you're hoping to gain, right? The desire to win becomes a huge source of energy. On the surface, duels in this game are a lot like sports. When players of about the same level and gear fight on first strike finish mode, there's absolutely no fear of HP dropping to a dangerous amount. But as Kirito trailed off, the piece of fossil wood popped and burst. A shower of red sparks shot up, melted into the darkness. Asuna traced the hilt of the chivalric rapier equipped on her left hip and picked up where Kirito had left off. But we're not using bats or rackets or even bamboo shinai swords. They're real steel. Sure, they're digital lines of code, but if they touch your opponent, they take away real life. Exactly. The more serious you take the duel, the less it becomes about seizing simple victory. Those who have no fear of slashing their opponents with steel weapons and taking their HP, those who must purely follow their purpose of killing their foe, will get the closest to victory. At its core, dueling is not a sport here. It's just bloodshed for the sake of survival. Winning has nothing to do with it. As those last words left my lips, Asuna felt a shiver run through her body. She recognized it as a very sensation that had foiled her hand earlier in that attempted duel. "I don't want to have to fight to the death with you, Kirito," she blurted out, then hastily clamped her mouth shut. He didn't tease her, though. "Yeah, me too. I don't want to do that with you either, even if it was just a first strike finish duel." She looked over in mild surprise and saw that Kirito was looking at her too, his black eyes reflecting the orange light of the campfire. Her temporary partner continued, "But I still think you ought to have some experience with dueling, with PvP, before we start tackling this floor in earnest." She stared back at him, unsure how to respond. Their aborted attempt at a duel was Asuna's idea, but that idea had come from something Kirito had said the previous evening as they climbed the spiral staircase to this floor. After they defeated Waithigi the Hippocampus, boss of the fourth floor, with the help of Kismel the Dark Elf Knight and Viscount Yoflis, Asuna and Kirito had left the members of the other guilds back in the chamber and continued up the spiral staircase to the fifth floor. The wall of the staircase hall was carved, as was customary with reliefs that symbolized the landscape and sights of the new floor. But most striking and memorable was the one on the large door of the top of every staircase. The relief was of a large ancient castle. It was not an elegant manor like Yofil Castle standing in the middle of a lake, but a heavy, imposing fortress. As he looked up at carving, Kirito sighed and said, "Looks like the basic terrain is the same as it was in the beta test." Asuna had asked him what kind of terrain that was, and he shrugged and explained, "Ruins, maybe 30% of the map is natural ground and the rest is all maze-like ruins," meaning the entire 6-mile across terrain was one huge dungeon. In a way, and it's really dark, there was a lot of PKing going on in here in the beta. PKing, player killing, and one of player killed was a PKer. She was familiar with that as a gaming term. Kirito had once said he wanted to buy the same hooded cape she wore to hide his face in town. When she'd pointed out that he could just as easily wear a burlap sack over his head, he replied that he would be mistaken for a PKer if he did that. At the time, it was light-hearted, silly conversation, so Asuna had essentially ignored and then forgotten the term. After all, there would never be PKing in Aincrad in its current state. Every player's wish was to escape the virtual world, and attacking, or God forbid, actually killing another player would only set the progress through the game back. That was how Asuna always saw things, and assumed she shared that opinion with Kirito. But when he'd mentioned the term PK in front of the door to the 5th floor, there was a firmness to his expression she'd never seen before. It had looked as if he was certain that the 5th floor and its ruins would be home to rampant PKing in the new deadly SAO, just as it was in the beta. The more she saw that look on his face, the more Asuna was convinced that after they activated the town portal and restocked their items, she should ask for a lesson of the basics of PvP combat. Their first attempt at a duel had reached a premature, pathetic end, and Asuna wasn't in the mood to try again very soon. So, as she sipped the sweet-smelling tea, she asked, "Kirito, do you really think there will be PKers on this floor?" He replied, swirling his tea in his cup. He stopped abruptly and looked at her. "Do you remember the player I dueled on the 3rd floor, near the Forest Elf camp?" "Yes, his name was Morche, right? The one who was plotting something because he was secretly part of both Lin's and Dragon Knight's brigade and Gabao's Einkrad Liberation Squad?" Kirito had told her about him just before the battle against the boss on the 3rd floor. It was a very intriguing and troubling story, and Asuna had briefly spotted the man himself in the Spider Queen's cave, so she'd been on the lookout for him on the 4th floor. That signature metal coif had never appeared, though. Her partner nodded and returned his gaze to the fire. There was an unusual tension to his features. "Morche challenged me to a half-finished duel, whittled my HP down to just above half, and tried to hit me with his axe for massive damage. If he'd been successful, he would have wiped out all of my HP and killed me. And having won a duel fair and square, he wouldn't have become an orange player. That would make it just as legal as a PK method as a monster PK, a dual PK. I guess. I'm amazed he thought of that." "Don't start being impressed with him," Asuna snapped. The swordsman wore a strained smile and agreed. His expression was serious again, and Kirito murmured, "The problem is why Morche would do such a thing. Based on the way he showed up, I don't think he's a pleasure PKer doing it for fun. The reason he challenged me to that duel was because he wanted to prevent me from completing the quest of the Forest Elf camp. And while I was held up, the DKB and ALS were closing in on the same camp for different quest lines. He wanted them to have a showdown fight." "Yeah," Asuna murmured, recalling the event. "When Kismil and I raced to the camp, it looked like they were ready to draw weapons at any second. If she hadn't stopped it then and there, the whole frontline group could have fallen apart. But even if he succeeded, how would that help Morche? What could he have possibly gained that would be worth a month worth delay in beating the game and obtaining everyone's freedom?" She asked it mostly to herself, but Kirito was contemplating the very same question. The DKB and ALS were so large that they represented nearly the entirety of the game's most advanced players. All the last attack bonuses from the bosses had been seized by the swordsman in black sitting beside Asuna, but at this point, it was essentially impossible to beat the Labyrinth Tower without those two guilds. A motive to make the two guilds fight. Ordinarily, a good reason would be to ride in during the chaos of the squabble and seize control of both guilds, taking command of leadership, in short, for glory, or perhaps looting the money and gear off those players who died in battle, for personal gain. But was it possible that one's lust for glory and riches could override their desire to survive? No matter how lofty your position in this world, no matter how many coal you earned, or how much elite gear you've equipped, it would all be worthless if you just lost in a fight just once, be it monster or player. you would simply die in this electronic prison and never return to the real world, something that didn't add up to Morche's motives. It looked like he was trying to interfere with the efforts to clear the game, but no one should actually think that way, especially if they were risking death by leaving the safety of town and venturing into the dangerous wilderness. Asuna's reason for fighting in the danger zone was, as one of the game's top players, was to someday escape this floating fortress. She would return to the real world and get back to her old life and forget all the fear and sadness she'd experienced here. Without realizing it, she glanced to her right. Her black-haired temporary partner was gazing into the crackling campfire. The way he was lost in thought removed his usual tense demeanor and actually made him look quite young. Escaping this world, that would mean... She forced herself to stop mid-thought and straightened her head with considerable willpower. Her eyes settled on the strange greenish fire surrounding the fossil wood branch. Compared to real fire, there was a touch of artificiality in the way that the tips of the flames moved. But it was real enough for Asuna, and beautiful too. Yes, the world they lived in was a cruel prison, but at times it could also be breathtakingly gorgeous. The city of the first floor, the plains of the second, the forest of the third, and the canals of the fourth. And the entire reason she was able to appreciate these things was due to the influence of the partner sitting beside her. She was struggling to keep her mind off that fact by pondering Morche's motives further, when Kirito broke his long silence to consider. Maybe Morche isn't the same kind of player as us, in the truest sense. Huh? What do you mean? Again, she looked at Kirito, who was still gazing intently into the campfire. If you assume that his motive in interfering with our forward progression itself is an act of sabotage directed by whoever's running this game of death, it does kind of make sense. Sabotage? You're saying he's working with Akihito Kayaba? Yeah, Kirito confirmed. However, he quickly shook his head. But even still, it doesn't add up. It would be one thing if we were just about to finish the game, but this guy started his activities when we were on the 3rd floor, out of 100. It's just too early. No, wait. Kirito's eyes suddenly gleamed. Right now! Huh? What? Asuna exclaimed, bolting upright at the same moment that Kirito drew his sword. The sharp tip of the elven stout sword traced a silver line in the darkness. He pierced the campfire with a thrust that was nearly as quick as Asuna's fencing. As she was watching in bewilderment, a huge storm of sparks floated into the night sky. When he pulled the sword back, something was speared on its tip. It was cooked to a light crisp, emitting a savory white steam. A baked yam. Kirito? Yep. When you were staring intently into the fire like that? Yep. Was it just to monitor how well the yam was cooking? You bet, he answered, straight-faced. In response, she wavered between yelling at him or punching him. But before she could put either plan into action, Kirito pulled the tip of the sweet potato and placed the sword in the sheath over his back. He tossed the hot potato from hand to hand and eventually split it into 2 halves. Another burst of steam issued forth, along with the sweet, fragrant scent. Here, he offered her 1 half. Given that 6 hours had passed since lunch, she decided she was generous enough to shelve her anger for now. The hot baked yam was not quite the same as a real sweet potato in color and texture, but it was still delicious. Asuna took a bite and let the soft filling melt like cream in her mouth, and the flavor rich and sweet. After a second bite, then a third, she took a drink of tea and sighed in contentment, and finally asked, "When did you buy this? I don't remember us stopping by a grocer." Kirito murmured and said evasively, I didn't buy them. So where did they come from? Don't tell me you picked this up off the ground on the third floor forest too. No way. These yams are B-level food ingredients. You can't just find them on the low floors like this one. So you got them from someone? I suppose you could say it like that, in a general sense. This is a drop from the half-fish, half-human looking monster on the fourth floor labyrinth. The unexpected answer left a loss for how to respond. If he'd said that it was a half-fish man meat, she would have had to throw it directly in his face. But a former possession seemed just safe enough to be acceptable. She took another bite quickly before asking her fourth question. Why would a half-fish man drop sweet potatoes? She was counting on one of his usual wry, slippery jokes, but was disappointed. He groaned, then hummed for 3 seconds, and set down the half-eaten baked potato. He returned her question with another one. Do you know where Satsuma sweet potatoes come from? Huh? Well, Satsuma was the old name for Kagoshima, right? I feel like I learned this in school. Somewhere named Aoki Kanyo brought the seeds from Satsuma province. Once she finished answering, she realized with the start that she nearly admitted she had been in middle school back in real life. She'd hardly ever talked to Kirito about life out there. Never, in fact. This was probably the second time ever. Kirito didn't seem to think much of the revelation. Yeah, to be precise, they first came over from Okinawa, but that's only in Japan. What I mean is, where were the first cultivated in the entire world? The world? She asked, slightly relieved. I think I heard that potatoes were originally from Latin America? Correct. Huh? Sweet potatoes originate from around there. Technically, potatoes were cultivated in the highlands of South and Central America, while sweet potatoes were raised in the lowlands around the coast. Oh. She popped the last piece into her mouth, savored the flavor, then brought the topic back around by asking, what does that have to do with fishmen? Well, this is just me trying to force the connection into place, he replied with a grin. He tossed the last piece of his baked potato up in the air and caught it in his mouth. But in the mythology of the Aztecs, the world has collapsed 4 times already. In the first world, people were eaten by packs of jaguars. In the second, people were turned into monkeys. In the third, they turned into birds. And in the last world, they were turned into fish. And the people who were turned into fish were the ones fighting us on the 4th floor labyrinth? She responded, skeptically. Kirito laughed good-naturedly. Maybe, maybe not. But remember what Kismel said? The various floors of Aincrad were separated from the earth long ago and rose into the sky. There were elves and kobolds and minotaurs in those sections. Who's to say there couldn't have been a monster from Aztec legends? What I want to know is... Asuna paused while she finished the tea in her teacup, then looked at him with both exasperation and admiration. How do you know so much about Aztec legends and the origin of sweet potatoes? Ah, he hedged, and she realized what she had done. She'd gone beyond the proper bounds of this world again. But her temporary partner only glanced at her briefly. The place I lived, on the other side, was famous for growing sweet potatoes. When I was in elementary school, I did my summer vacation report on the history of sweet potatoes. Funny how I still remember that stuff. Oh, she mumbled, keeping her face straight while her brain worked away furiously at a new subroutine. If it was famous for sweet potatoes, that meant it either was Kagoshima or Ibaraki, but Kirito's vocabulary and intonation were hardly different from Asuna's Tokyo Japanese, so it could be some area around Tokyo famous for sweet potatoes, but did such a place exist? If anything was likely, it would be Chiba or Saitama, perhaps the west of Tokyo. If she had a real-life phone, she could do a search instantly. After a half second of this rapid thought process, she closed her eyes and cut it short. If the game of death was ever beaten, everything in this world would vanish, all the equipment, items, and personal connections. She didn't want that to be a bad thing. It would make her lose sight of her reason to keep pushing onward. "Thanks for the potato and the potato facts," she said, clapping her hands to drive that lingering thought from her mind. "Now, as for Morche." Right. Kirito said, blinking and getting his mind back into the important topic at hand. "We were wondering if Morche was working with Akihito Kayaba or not. Well, I know I brought it up, but I don't think it's likely. Morche's just an exception to the rule for now. A player working off the motives that don't line up with our logic or reason. That's how we should see him, for now. There's just one thing that bothers me." He paused, his eyes staring sharply into the quiet blaze of the campfire. This time, he did not pull out another set of potatoes. "We've already heard a similar story." "Huh?" she blurted out, then remembered. "Oh, from Neza!" Asuna held her breath until Kirito silently nodded. They'd met the player blacksmith Neza on the second floor. He'd used the quick change mod to secretly steal her wind florette, a choice forced upon him by his guild, the Legend Braves. But the trick in question wasn't his own idea. The man who spoke to them in the bar and taught them the trick to that scam for free, the one in the black poncho, Kirito went on, voice low. I think his true goal for Neza to be judged by the rest of the top players. If it weren't for the rest of the Braves getting down on the hands and knees to beg for forgiveness in the second floor boss fight, they might have executed Neza. In a way, that would be PKing, carefully toying with the thoughts of various players, guiding them into ultimately killing each other. You might call it provocation PK. Asuna felt her features twist at the ugly nastiness of the idea. Monster PKing, MPK, and dual PKing, DPK, were bad enough, but they also involved amount of risk on the part of the person attempting it. In constructing an MPK, any mistake might cause the monster to attack the PKer, and in a DPK, you could always end up losing instead. But provocation PK, if it were a common enough concept to have its own acronym, it would be PPK, completely removed any direct risk for the one orchestrating it. The perpetuator just stayed comfortable in the center, guiding the individuals and groups into direct confrontation around him. The chances of success seemed lower than an MPK or DPK in every world. There were people extraordinarily skilled at manipulating others. Even at all-girls school Asuna attended, there were students who otherwise didn't stand out, but could use emails, texts, and rumors to manipulate the mood of the class and apply pressure whenever they wanted. They were probably doing it without realizing their skill, but this mysterious man in the black poncho tried to have Neza killed with clear malicious purpose. "Do you suppose Morche and the black poncho could be the same person?" she asked. Kirito traced the spot between his brows with a finger. Neza described the black poncho as a man who laughed gleefully, and Morche certainly did enjoy his chuckles, so they could be the same person. If that's the case, then Like I said earlier, Morche might just be a unique solo PKer who refuses to abide by common logic of Aincrad. But if they're separate people, then the situation is more dire than that. The campfire, which was finally losing fuel and strength, popped in a burst of sparks. Asuna flinched, then, hesitantly, turned to her partner. What do you mean by dire? Kirito took a number of breaths, hesitating to answer, before he finally spoke in a low voice. If they're separate people, we should assume that Morche and the Black Poncho are working together. Meaning they're working to commit PKs as a duo? Or perhaps even more than two? There could be 3, 4, or an entire gang of PKers out there in Aincrad somewhere. The fossil wood branch finally reached the end of its durability and crumbled through the middle, disappearing with a large sheet of sparks. As the tiny lights went out, the darkness of their surroundings kept closer. Asuna unconsciously moved herself a few inches to the right. But if you kill players in SAO right now, they can't be revived. They'll die in the real world. Do Morche and his friends not want us to beat the game? Don't they want us to get out of this place? She rasped, her voice so hoarse and dry that she had trouble hearing herself. Nearly 10 seconds later, Kirito's response was just as strained. Maybe they're not concerned with whether we escape at all. Like you said, when your HP goes down to 0, the player dies. So they just want to cause PKs to commit murder. Asuna thought she heard a rustle behind her and spun around, but the only thing there was a series of dark, ruined walls, cold and unfeeling.